Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most ironic succession stories in all of history. Genghis Khan's sons turned the largest empire ever built into a family feud reality. Show the moment he stopped breathing. Like a founder who dies, and his four sons break the global company into four rival subsidiaries, each filing lawsuits and hiring hitmen against each other, while still claiming we're one family. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you? I always love seeing who's out there in the dark with me. Honestly, it's the best part of this whole thing. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people think of the Mongol Empire, one image usually marches straight into their minds. Genghis Khan on horseback, mane flying, leading a horde of kill everyone barbarians, with war drums and screaming in the background, while his lieutenant is thinking, "Boss, can we at least discuss where we're raiding next?" According to popular culture, these guys were essentially human war machines, Lego figures with no joints, permanently stuck in an expression called infinite bloodlust. They never stopped to think. Unless you count spending 3 days arguing over how to split the loot, so they each got a little more. They never negotiated. Because negotiation is for the weak, and they were better at building pyramids out of enemy skulls with millimeter precision, and they apparently spent every waking hour practicing horse archery, looting, and psychological terror. Like you at work thinking, how do I take down the guy in the next cubicle? Except when they acted on it, they actually burned the whole city to ash. The reality, as usual, is far less cinematic and considerably more human. And honestly, it's way weirder than anything Hollywood ever made up. Because this isn't a story about heroes or monsters. It's about a family who inherited the most terrifying legacy in history, tore the empire apart in less than 70 years, and then blamed each other for betraying the blood of their ancestors. The cruelest punchline. They kept saying, "We're family," right up to the moment they ground each other's last cities into dust. Let's start on the morning of August 18, 1227, somewhere in the harsh hills of the Liupan Mountains, where a dying old man is telling his sons, "Stay united, or you'll destroy yourselves." His sons lower their heads and say nothing. But we all know what happened next. The morning of August 18, 1227, somewhere in the harsh hills of the Liupan Mountains, a man who had conquered more territory than any human in history lay dying. And the only sound was the wind scraping across dry grass. Genghis Khan was not yet 70, though his body had long since stopped cooperating with the ambition that still burned inside it. He had fallen from his horse the previous year while hunting, a humiliation that a lesser man might have dismissed as bad luck, but which the Khan understood as a message from the sky. The wound festered. The fever came. And now, with the taste of iron in his mouth, and the faces of his sons gathered around him like hungry birds, he faced the one campaign he could not win. When I first read the accounts of this deathbed scene, I was struck less by the famous last words, the strategic advice, the warnings about unity, than by what the chronicles do not say. No one recorded whether his sons wept. No one mentioned if he reached out to touch their faces. The secret history of the Mongols, that extraordinary 13th century text compiled after his death, gives us the grand political theater, but withholds the intimate tremor. Perhaps the compilers simply did not consider it important. Or perhaps they knew that in a world built entirely on conquest, tenderness was a kind of treason. The sons themselves were a study in controlled fracture. Chagatai, the eldest, was already dead, poisoned, some whispered, or simply faded by the suspicion that had shadowed his entire life. The rumor that his mother had been captured and impregnated by an enemy, making his bloodline suspect. Chagatai, the second son, was the empire's disciplinarian, a man who believed in law the way other men believed in gods, rigid and unforgiving. Urgide the third was the one Genghis chose as his successor, and the choice tells us something important about what the old Khan valued in his final years. Not the fiercest warrior, not the purest ideologue, the one who could drink, laugh, and hold a room together while everyone around him tore at each other's throats. And Talyui, the youngest, was the soldier's soldier, the one who stayed by his father's side in every campaign, the one who commanded the armies and received the smallest share of power in return. It is a family dynamic so familiar it could be a Chinese opera or a Shakespearean history play, except that the stage was half the known world. What happened next is often told as a story of seamless succession, of the Mongol Empire rising to its greatest heights under Urgide and his heirs. But that version leaves out something essential. From the moment Genghis Khan stopped breathing, and we do not know exactly where his body was laid, only that it was carried in secret, and that every soul who saw the funeral procession was killed to preserve the location. The empire began to crack. Not loudly at first, not visibly, the way ice creaks underfoot in late winter, when the surface still looks solid, but the dark water is already moving underneath. Urgide ruled for 12 years, and by any conventional measure, they were extraordinary. He finished the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, pushed deep into Korea, sent armies crashing against the edges of Europe, all the way to the gates of Vienna. The Mongol military machine under his command functioned with a terrifying precision that made the armies of Europe and Asia look like disorganized mobs. But Urgide himself was a man who governed through delegation and indulgence, and the indulgence eventually consumed him. He drank. The secret history records that his brother Chagatai appointed a steward to limit Urgide to a certain number of cups of wine per day, and Urgide responded by ordering his cups made larger. There is something almost endearing about this, a moment of human absurdity in the middle of an imperial machine, a until you remember that the decisions made by this drunk man determined whether entire cities lived or died. In 1241, Urgide died of what the sources politely call a drinking illness, though the implication is clear enough. He was 55, and the empire suddenly had no clear hand at the helm. To me, the most unsettling part of this period is not the violence. You expect violence from the Mongols, but the uncertainty. For nearly 5 years after Urgide's death, the empire drifted without a ruler. His widow Turigine took control as regent, and she was herself a figure of immense complexity, a woman who had been captured in war, forced into marriage, and who now maneuvered with a subtlety that her husband's generals could not match. She bribed, she purged, she delayed the election of a new Khan until she could secure the position for her son Guyuk. And in doing so, she deepened every fault line already present in the imperial family. The sons of Chagatai, the doubted eldest brother, had built their own power base in the western steppes, what would become the Golden Horde. They did not recognize Guyuk's authority. Chagatai's descendants controlled Central Asia and looked at everyone else with contempt. And Talyui's widow, a woman named Sorgatani Biki, who might have been the most capable politician of the entire 13th century, was quietly positioning her own sons for a future that nobody yet saw coming. If you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine the map of Eurasia in the 1240s. From the Pacific Ocean to the Carpathian Mountains, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, there is no single political authority that commands universal loyalty. There are 4 distinct power centers, each controlled by a branch of the same family, each claiming legitimacy from the same dead grandfather, each preparing to destroy the others if necessary. This is the secret truth that the grand narrative of Mongol unity tries to hide. The empire was never truly united after Genghis Khan's death. It was held together by inertia, by shared memory, by the sheer momentum of conquest. But underneath the appearance of coordination, the cousins were already drawing lines in the sand. Guyuk's reign lasted less than 2 years. He died in 1248, probably of natural causes, though the timing was so convenient for his enemies that poison has never been ruled out. His death left the empire again without a clear leader, and this time the power shifted decisively. Sorgatani Biki, the widow of Talyui, had spent years building alliances, cultivating the military commanders, placing her sons in positions of authority. She was a Nestorian Christian in a shamanic and Buddhist court, a woman in a world of men, and she had done what none of the male heirs had managed. She played the long game. When her son Merk was elected Great Khan in 1251, it was not just a change of ruler. It was a coup dressed in the robes of tradition. The house of Talyui had seized control of the empire, and the other branches of the family understood this as the act of usurpation it was. Merk Khan was everything his predecessors had not been: sober, disciplined, ruthless in a methodical way rather than a passionate one. He purged the opposition with a thoroughness that left the steppes wet with his cousin's blood. The Ojdade and Chagatai lines were hunted down, executed, scattered. An estimated 90 princes and nobles were killed in the first wave of what amounts to a family massacre. And here is where I have to pause, because I have no definitive answer for why the Mongols, who had conquered the world, could not stop killing each other. You might say that this is simply the nature of imperial succession, that Rome and Persia and China all had their own versions of this bloodletting. But there was something specific to the Mongol experience that made their internal violence so persistent, so structural. Perhaps it was the absence of a fixed law of succession. Genghis Khan had never clearly established whether the empire passed to the strongest son, the chosen son, or simply the one who could seize it. Perhaps it was the nomadic tradition of dividing herds among all sons, applied disastrously to a settled empire that could not be divided without tearing itself apart. Or perhaps it was simply that when you have been raised to believe that power is something you take, not something you inherit, you do not stop taking just because someone else has claimed the title. Under Merk, the empire expanded in two directions simultaneously. His brother Hulagu marched west into Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate, carrying with him orders that would end 6 centuries of Islamic caliphal rule. Another brother, Kublai, pushed south and east into the remaining territories of the Song dynasty in China. The Mongol war machine, now turned fully outward again, was still capable of staggering violence. When Hulagu reached Baghdad in 1258, he gave the city a week to surrender. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, refused, perhaps genuinely believing that God would protect the seat of the Islamic world, perhaps simply unable to comprehend that his ancient civilization was about to be erased. When I first read the account of what followed, I had to put the book down. The Mongols breached the walls, and for 7 days they killed. Not soldiers, not just resistance fighters. Everyone. The estimates range from tens of thousands to over 1 million dead, depending on which chronicle you trust. The Tigris ran black with ink from the libraries, destroyed manuscripts, and red with blood. The Caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, because Mongol taboo forbade spilling royal blood on the ground, and this was the workaround they had devised. But even as Hulagu was building his own domain in Persia, the Ilkhanate, it would come to be called, a messenger arrived from the steppes with news that changed everything. Merk Khan was dead. He had died in 1259 during the siege of Diaoyu Castle in Sichuan, not from an enemy arrow or a military defeat, but from dysentery or perhaps cholera, the kind of undignified death that conquering heroes are not supposed to suffer. And the moment the news reached the far-flung corners of the empire, every campaign stopped. Hulagu turned back from his advance toward Syria and Egypt, taking most of his army with him, leaving only a skeleton force that would be crushed by the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The first major defeat the Mongols had ever suffered in open battle. The history of the world turned on that deathbed in Sichuan, on a bacterial infection in a general's gut. If Mernk had lived another 5 years, the Mongols might have taken Egypt, crushed the Mamluks, swept across North Africa into Spain. The entire shape of the Mediterranean world would have been different. Instead, a civil war was brewing between two brothers, and the empire would never recover. The brothers were Kublai and Erik Berk, and their war for succession in 1260 was not just a political dispute, but a philosophical one. Kublai, stationed in China, had become something his ancestors never were, a ruler who had fallen in love with civilization. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, adopted Confucian ceremonies, built a new capital at what would become Beijing. The Mongol traditionalists in the homeland looked at him with deep suspicion. He had gone soft, they whispered. He had forgotten the felt tents and the mare's milk. He was becoming a Chinaman. Erik Berk, the younger brother who had stayed in Karakoram, the old Mongol capital on the steppe, positioned himself as the defender of traditional values. He was the candidate of the pure Mongols, the ones who still believed that cities were traps and that a real Khan lived on horseback. The war lasted 4 years, and it was devastating precisely because it was a family fight. Both sides knew each other's tactics. Both sides had access to the same military traditions. The battles were close, brutal, and inconclusive for long stretches. In the end, Kublai won because he controlled the resources of China, the grain, the taxes, the bureaucrats who could keep an army supplied across vast distances. Erik Berk surrendered in 1264, and Kublai treated him with a mercy that surprised everyone. He spared his brother's life, at least for a few years, until what the sources call mysterious death occurred in captivity. But the damage was done. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, had watched the civil war and drawn their own conclusions. If the great Khan could not control his own family, why should they obey him? Why should they send tribute? Why should they coordinate their campaigns? Kublai would go on to found the Yuan dynasty, rule China for decades, and become one of the most famous emperors in human history. Marco Polo would visit his court and bring back stories that made Europe dizzy with wonder. But Kublai's rule marks the moment when the Mongol Empire ceased to be an empire in any meaningful sense and became instead a collection of independent states that happened to share a common ancestry. The Great Khan in China was still technically the supreme ruler, but nobody outside China believed it. The Golden Horde made war on the Ilkhanate. The Chagatai Khanate raided the territory of the Yuan. Cousins fought cousins across the map, and the dream of a unified Mongol world order crumbled into the dust of 100 battlefields. I have argued that the empire began to die the moment Genghis Khan closed his eyes. But halfway through writing this, I started to doubt myself. Perhaps the empire never truly existed as a unified entity at all. Perhaps what we call the Mongol Empire was simply a brief window of coordinated violence, a moment when 4 or 5 extraordinary individuals happened to share enough alignment of interest to terrify the world together. the moment that alignment broke, and it broke almost immediately, what remained was not an empire, but a memory, not a structure, but a story that the Mongols told themselves about who they had been. And there is something heartbreaking in that, if you let yourself feel it. The largest contiguous land empire in history, built by the greatest conqueror the world has ever known, and it held together for less than a single human lifetime before the family that built. It tore it to pieces. But that is not quite true either, and I want to be honest with you. Something did survive. Something carried forward across the generations, even as the Khanates drifted apart and warred with each other and forgot their grandfather's face. It was not political unity. It was not a shared government or a common currency. It was something stranger and harder to name. The Mongols never stopped believing that they were one family, even as they slaughtered each other. A prince of the Golden Horde might ride against a prince of the Ilkhanate, but he would not call him a foreigner. He would call him a cousin. He would call him a traitor to the blood. The word for this, in the language of the steppe, was Urug, the lineage, the bone, the thing that cannot be dissolved, no matter how many wrongs accumulate between its members. And it was this belief, perhaps even more than their horses or their bows, that made the Mongols who they were. It was also what would destroy them, slowly, over centuries, as the descendants of Genghis Khan multiplied into the thousands, and then the tens of thousands, each one believing that the blood of the conqueror flowed in their veins, each one holding a claim to power that could never be fully satisfied. The story of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan is not a story of decline. It is a story of replication without control, of a family that grew too large for the world to contain, of a lineage that became its own worst enemy. And if you want to see where that path leads, you have to follow the horse tracks east into China, where Kublai was building something new out of the ruins of the old. There is old Karakoram, with its felt walls and the smell of smoke and horsehide. And then there is Shangdu, which Kublai built out of a dream he did not entirely trust. When Marco Polo described it to his Venetian listeners years later, he spoke of a palace of marble and a park of silk, of a great Khan who spent summers among the bamboo, and the wild animals tamed into a kind of decorative wilderness. What Marco did not say, what he perhaps could not see, was that Shangdu was a compromise built on a wound. Kublai's own grandmother had lived in a felt tent until the day she died. His father had never slept in a city. And here was Kublai, the son of the steppe, commissioning a palace with painted ceilings and a library of Confucian texts, trying to rule 1 billion people who did not think of him as their emperor, but as a barbarian who had conquered them by force. Every brick Shangdu was a statement of apology and ambition, and every brick was also a lie. The capital he would eventually settle on, the one we still know as Beijing, was even more ambitious. He called it Khanbalik, the city of the Khan, and he rebuilt it on a scale that made the old Chinese capitals look provincial. Wide boulevards running north to south, markets organized by trade, a canal system that brought grain from the south to feed a population of 500,000. Kublai was never quite comfortable in his own city. He kept his summer retreat in Shangdu. He preserved the hunting grounds that reminded him of the open steppe, and he insisted that the Mongol princes who came to court should continue to wear their traditional leather and fur, even as the Chinese officials beside them wore silk robes embroidered with dragons. When I first read William of Rubruck's account of a Mongol court from a few decades before Kublai, I was struck by the casual mixture of splendor and filth, carpets encrusted with dust, cups of gold passed around beside cuts of raw meat, the Khan's own hands stained with grease. Kublai tried to clean all that up. He imported Persian administrators, Chinese scholars, Tibetan monks, Nestorian priests, Muslim merchants. He wanted his court to be cosmopolitan in the way that a storm is universal. But the grease did not wash off entirely, and the Mongol princes who came to pay homage looked at their emperor sitting on a dragon throne and wondered, quietly, whether he was still one of them. The army Kublai inherited was still the most formidable fighting force on earth, but it was no longer the army his grandfather had commanded. Genghis Khan's soldiers had been nomadic herders who could ride before they could walk, who carried their entire lives on horseback, who could live on mare's milk and dried meat for weeks, and still fight 2 battles in a day. Kublai's army was becoming something different. An occupation force, a garrison army, a military that needed supply lines and logistics and bureaucrats to tell the generals where the grain was stored. The transition from conquest to governance is always brutal in its own quiet way, and Kublai felt it in every decision he made. He still sent armies out against the Song in the south, against the kingdoms of Korea and Vietnam and Burma. But the campaigns took longer, cost more, and produced less glory. The old Mongol officers grumbled that the army had gone soft. The Chinese generals grumbled that the Mongols did not understand siege warfare. And Kublai sat in the middle, trying to hold 2 completely different military traditions together with sheer will. The invasion of Japan in 1274 was the first clear sign that the limits of Mongol power had been reached. Kublai sent a fleet of somewhere between 800 and 900 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 men, across the Tsushima Strait to conquer an island kingdom that had refused to pay tribute. The Mongols won their initial beachhead. They pushed the Japanese defenders back, and then a typhoon came, what the Japanese would call kamikaze, the divine wind, and the Mongol fleet was scattered and destroyed. 1,000 years of naval tradition had not prepared the Mongols for the open sea. They were riders, not sailors, and the water did not care about their reputation. When I first read the account of this disaster, I was not surprised that the Mongols tried again in 1281, this time with a fleet twice the size, perhaps 4,000 ships and 140,000 men. It was the logical response of a power that had never learned humility. Failed invasion, send a bigger army. And again, the kamikaze came, or perhaps just a well-timed seasonal typhoon. And again, the fleet was destroyed, and the survivors who washed ashore in Japan were slaughtered by samurai who had been waiting for them. I honestly cannot decide if this is brave or foolish, the decision to try again. On paper, it looks like strategic insanity, the same plan that failed, executed with more resources, against an enemy that had already proven its defensive capability. But the Mongols had never been deterred by failure. They had lost battles before and won wars. They had seen cities resist for years and eventually fall. The problem with Japan was different. The sea was not a city. It could not be starved into submission or bribed or frightened. It simply did what it did, and the Mongols, for all their power, could not negotiate with the weather. The second invasion was more catastrophic than the first. The casualty figures are disputed, but something like half the Mongol force died, killed by storms or by Japanese swords or by starvation on the islands they had briefly captured. Kublai never tried again. He considered a third invasion, planned it, gave orders for ships to be built. But the resources never materialized, and the momentum never returned. There is a kind of tragedy in this. The greatest empire on earth, stopped by the one element it could not master. But the invasions of Japan were only the most dramatic sign of a deeper rot. Kublai's empire was bleeding money. The wars were expensive. The bureaucracy was expensive. The new cities and canals and palaces were all expensive. The traditional Mongol economy had been based on tribute and plunder. You conquered a city. You took everything of value. You moved on. The Yuan dynasty could not function like that. It needed a tax system, a currency, a way to extract wealth from a settled agricultural society without destroying it. Kublai tried paper money, the first large-scale use of fiat currency in world history, and it worked for a while. Merchants could trade across the empire without carrying gold. The government could print money to pay for its projects, and the whole system hummed along like a well-oiled machine. But paper money only works as long as people believe in it, and belief is a fragile thing. By the end of Kublai's reign, inflation was eating away at the value of the currency. The government was printing more money to cover its deficits, and the ordinary Chinese farmer who had accepted paper notes for his grain was beginning to wonder if he had been cheated. A 1285 document from the Yuan treasury records that the government printed over 500 million paper cash notes in a single year, an amount that no economy could absorb without collapsing. The contradictions of Kublai's rule went deeper than economics. He was a Mongol emperor ruling China, and he could never quite decide whether he wanted to be a Chinese emperor or a Mongol Khan. He adopted the Chinese imperial rituals, the bowing, and the incense, and the ancestral tablets, but he also kept the Mongol traditions of mounted archery and the tribal feasts where the wine flowed until everyone was sick. He promoted Buddhism over the native Chinese traditions of Taoism, But he also employed Confucian scholars and gave them positions in his government. He tried to maintain the Mongol legal code, the Yasa, alongside Chinese law, but the two systems contradicted each other at almost every point. The Mongols believed in collective responsibility. If a man committed a crime, his whole family paid. The Chinese believed in individual guilt and gradations of punishment. The Mongols did not execute nobles by beheading, because blood should not be spilled, but the Chinese executioner's blade did not discriminate by rank. Every day, Kublai had to choose which tradition to honor and which to betray, and every choice made someone angry. The Mongol princes in the homeland watched Kublai's Sinicization with a mixture of contempt and fear. They whispered that he had abandoned the ways of the steppe, that he wore silk instead of leather, that he slept on a bed instead of the ground, that he had forgotten the language of his forefathers. Some of them rebelled outright. In 1262, a Mongol general in the north named Li Tan rose against Kublai, and the rebellion was only crushed after months of fighting. In 1277, a group of Mongol princes attempted a coup, hoping to replace Kublai with a more traditional Khan, and they too were defeated. Each rebellion cost money, cost lives, cost the trust that was already eroding between the emperor and his family. To me, the most unsettling part of this period is not the violence of the rebellions, but the loneliness of Kublai himself. He was surrounded by millions of subjects and hundreds of relatives, and he trusted almost none of them. His Chinese officials served him because he paid them. His Mongol generals served him because they feared him. His own sons competed for his favor, and his wives, he had more than 50, the chronicles tell us, though 4 were principal ones, maneuvered for influence like the courtiers of any dynasty. And then there was his mother, Sorgatani Biki, the woman who had placed the house of Talyui on the throne through decades of patient manipulation, was long dead by the time Kublai became emperor. But her influence haunted every decision he made. She had been a Nestorian Christian, and she had raised her sons to be religiously tolerant, to see the value in every faith, and Kublai carried that tolerance into his rule. He invited Buddhists from Tibet, Muslims from Persia, Christians from the West, and gave them all positions in his court. The Tibetan Lama Phagpa became his imperial prelate, and the Mongol script was reformed to accommodate the Tibetan alphabet. The Venetian Polo family, Marco and his father and uncle, were welcomed as curiosities, as trading partners, as windows into a Europe that Kublai could not conquer, but could admire. When I read Marco Polo's description of Kublai's court, I am always struck by the detail that the emperor would sit at a raised table during feasts, surrounded by his wives and children, while the vast hall below him filled with Mongol princes, Chinese officials, Persian astrologers, and Tibetan monks, all eating in careful silence until the Khan nodded and the feast began. It is a picture of absolute control and also of absolute isolation. The Khan is the center of everything and knows nothing. The question that haunted Kublai in his later years the question that I think haunts every ruler who inherits a conquered empire, was simple. How do you hold something together that you did not build, that you cannot fully understand, and that you cannot fully abandon? The Chinese did not love him. The Mongols did not fully trust him. The other Khanates of the empire, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, had stopped even pretending to obey him. They traded with each other, fought with each other, sent each other ambassadors, but they no longer sent tribute to Karakoram or Khanbalik. They no longer recognized the great Khan as anything more than a first among equals, and sometimes not even that. When the Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam in 1295, he did not ask for Kublai's permission. When the Golden Horde allied with the Mamluk Sultanate against the Ilkhanate, they did not consult the Yuan court. The empire that Genghis Khan had forged into a single terrifying machine had splintered into 4 independent powers, each pursuing its own interests, each governed by a descendant of the old Khan, each claiming the same legacy while betraying it in practice. If you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine the map of Eurasia in the year 1290, 6 years before Kublai's death. The Yuan dynasty holds China, Mongolia, Tibet, and Korea. The Chagatai Khanate controls the heart of Central Asia, from the Altai Mountains to the Oxus River. The Ilkhanate rules Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. The Golden Horde dominates the Russian steppes, from the Carpathians to Lake Balkhash. These 4 states cover a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height, larger than any empire that had ever existed before, and they are all ruled by the same family. But they are not allies. They are not even enemies in the traditional sense. They are something more complicated, a family that has grown so large, so dispersed, so alienated from itself, that it no longer recognizes its own reflection in its cousin's face. A Mongol prince. The Ilkhanate might speak Persian, wear Turkish armor, pray to Allah, and never in his life see the steppe where his great-grandfather was born. A Mongol prince of the Yuan dynasty might speak Chinese, write poetry, practice Buddhism, and look at the Western Khanates as a distant and slightly embarrassing branch of the family tree. The blood still binds them, but the blood is thinned by distance, by language, by religion, by the slow erosion of shared memory. Kublai died in 1294, at the age of almost 80, a remarkable lifespan for a man who had spent most of it at war. The chronicles say that he died peacefully, surrounded by his family, his last words advising his grandson Timur to govern wisely and maintain the unity of the empire. I do not know if those words are real or if they were invented by a historian who wanted to give the emperor a dignified exit. What I know is that the unity Kublai asked for did not exist even while he was alive, and it certainly did not survive his death. The Yuan dynasty would continue for another 70 years under a succession of Khans, each weaker than the last, each facing rebellions and inflation, and the slow unraveling of Mongol authority in China. But the story of the descendants was no longer just a story of China. It was a story that ran across 4 separate histories, each one desperate, contradictory, and full of violence, each one trying to answer the same impossible question. What does it mean to be the heir of Genghis Khan when the world his heirs have inherited is falling apart in their hands? The horse tracks diverge here, and to follow them, all you have to split yourself into 4 riders, one for each Khanate, one for each doomed attempt to hold the legacy together. Let us ride first into the west, where the Golden Horde was already learning that the steppe does not forgive. The horse tracks lead west, and the first thing you notice is the silence. The Golden Horde, that great Khanate that stretched from the banks of the Dnieper to the gates of Siberia, was built on the bones of cities that no longer existed. Kiev, once the jewel of Rus, was a ghost town when the Mongols first finished with it in 1240. The chroniclers wrote that the streets were piled so high with bodies that the living walked on the dead to move from one district to another. But by the time we arrive in the late 13th century, even the bodies have turned to dust, and the grass has grown back over the ruins, and the Mongol princes who rule this territory do not bother rebuilding what they destroyed. They do not need cities. They need pasture for their horses, tribute from the Russian principalities that still survive in the forests to the north, and slaves to sell to the merchants of Genoa and Venice, who come across the Black Sea with ships full of cloth and wine and ambition. The ruler of the Golden Horde in its early years was Batu, the son of Chagatai, the doubted eldest son of Genghis Khan. Batu had commanded the invasion of Europe in the 1230s and 1240s, had crushed the armies of Poland and Hungary, had reached the Adriatic before the news of Urgiday's death pulled him back. He was a man who had seen the limits of the world, the ocean to the west, the forests to the north, and he knew that the Mongols had conquered everything worth conquering in this direction. The rest was just mopping up, just collecting tribute, just managing a domain that was already too large for any single ruler to control. Batu founded his capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga, a city of felt tents and brick buildings, and the constant movement of horses and merchants and envoys from half a dozen kingdoms. The Russian princes came here to bow, to pay, to beg for the patent that would allow them to rule their own lands as vassals of the Khan. The Greek bishops came to negotiate the status of the Orthodox Church under Mongol rule. The envoys from the Mamluk Sultanate came to form alliances against the Ilkhanate to the south. Sarai was a crossroads, a marketplace of power, a place where the fate of millions was decided in conversations that left no written record. When I first read the history of the Golden Horde, I was struck by something that seems almost contradictory on the surface. The Mongols of the West were the most brutal of all the Mongol regimes. They had depopulated entire regions, turned fertile farmland into steppe, reduced the population of the Rus principalities by something like half. And yet they were also, in many ways, the most tolerant. The Golden Horde did not impose Mongol customs on their subjects. They did not demand conversion to shamanism or Buddhism or any faith. They collected their tribute, They kept the peace on the trade routes, and they left the local rulers in place as long as the tribute arrived on time and no rebellion stirred. The Russian Orthodox Church was granted special privileges, exempted from taxation, allowed to operate freely, because the Mongols understood that the church could serve as a tool of control. The peasants paid their tithes to the church, and the church paid its prayers to the Khan, and the system worked well enough that some Russian historians have argued that the Mongol yoke was less oppressive than later national myths would claim. But I have never been able to accept that argument fully. Yes, the Mongols allowed the Russians to keep their customs. Yes, they protected the church. But they also sold Russian children into slavery by the thousands. They burned villages that resisted and sowed salt into the fields. They demanded that the princes of Moscow and Tver and Novgorod travel to Sarai to beg for their thrones, and they executed those who displeased them without a second thought. Tolerance is not kindness. It is a calculation. The 13th century wore on, and the Golden Horde grew rich on the trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. The Silk Road, that ancient network of caravans and mercantile cities, was safer under Mongol rule than it had ever been before. A merchant could travel from Crimea to China without being robbed, as long as he carried the Khan's pesa, a metal tablet that granted safe passage, and paid the appropriate tolls at each checkpoint. The Genoese established trading colonies at Kaffa and Sudak on the Crimean coast, and they shipped grain and furs and slaves back to Italy in exchange for cloth and weapons and silver. The Venetian Marco Polo had traveled this route, or something like it, to reach the court of Kublai Khan. The whole system hummed with energy, with profit, with the quiet satisfaction of everyone involved getting richer, while the Mongols kept the peace. But even in its golden age, the Golden Horde carried the seed of its own disintegration. The same problem that had plagued the Mongol Empire from the beginning, succession, was now splitting the House of Jogye into factions that could not stand each other. Badu died in 1255, probably of natural causes, though the timing was suspicious enough that some chroniclers suggested poison. His brother Berk succeeded him, and Berk was a man who believed in something. He had converted to Islam, not the casual syncretic Islam that many Mongol princes practiced, but a real, fire-breathing, prophet-honoring faith that made him look at his cousins in the Ilkhanate with the same contempt that a crusader might feel for a Saracen. The Ilkhanate, under Hulagu and his successors, had aligned itself with Buddhism and Christianity, had crushed the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, had executed the Caliph himself. Berk never forgave them. He sent a message to Hulagu, according to the chronicler Rashid al-Din, that said something like, "You have destroyed the cities of Islam and killed the Caliph. With the help of God, I will call you to account for the blood of the innocent." And so the first Mongol civil war between Khanates began, not over territory or tribute, but over religion, over the memory of a murdered caliph, over the question of whether a Mongol could still be a Mongol after he had chosen a god. The war between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate lasted for decades, flaring up and dying down like a fire that could not be fully extinguished. Berke allied with the Mamluks of Egypt, the same Mamluks who had crushed the Mongols at Ain Jalut, because the enemy of my enemy is my cousin's enemy. The two Mongol states bled each other in the Caucasus, along the frontier of the mountains and the plains, in battles that were fought with the same tactics and the same weapons and the same ferocity that their ancestors had used against the Chinese and the Persians. And while they fought, the Russian princes watched and learned. They saw that the Mongols were not invincible. They saw that the Golden Horde could be distracted, could be bribed, could be outmaneuvered if you knew where the weaknesses were. A 1283 document from the court of the Grand Prince of Vladimir, preserved in the Russian chronicles, records a payment of 12,000 silver grivna to the Khan's representative to secure the prince's position. The Mongols were still strong, but they were becoming predictable. They had become, in a sense, a machine that could be understood, and anything that can be understood can eventually be broken. To me, the most unsettling part of this slow decline is the way the Mongols themselves seem to sense it. The Khans of the Golden Horde in the late 13th and early 14th centuries were not the iron-willed conquerors of the previous generation. They were men who had inherited power rather than seized it, who had grown up in palaces instead of tents, who had learned to read and write and appreciate poetry, and convert to religions that promised salvation after death. Chagatai Khan, who ruled from 1291 to 1312, spent most of his reign fighting his own cousins, suppressing rebellions within the horde, trying to hold together a confederation that was pulling apart at every seam. When I read the account of his death, he drowned in a river during a campaign, which is the kind of undignified end that the Mongols would have found deeply ironic. I could not help but think that the Golden Horde was already drowning too, slowly, over generations, in the very wealth and success that its founders had created. The most famous ruler of the Golden Horde, at least in the popular imagination, was Beg Khan, who ascended to the throne in 1313 and ruled for almost 30 years. He made Islam the official religion of the Golden Horde, built mosques in Sarai, patronized scholars and poets, and turned his court into a center of Islamic civilization that would have been unrecognizable to Batu or Berke. The Russian chronicles record that Beg was a just ruler, that he protected the church despite his own faith, that he maintained the peace along the trade routes, and allowed the Russian principalities to flourish under his protection. But the same chronicles also record that he executed his own son for conspiring with the Byzantines, that he crushed a rebellion in the Crimean Peninsula with a brutality that shocked even his own generals, that he sold tens of thousands of Russian slaves to the Mamluk Sultanate to finance his wars. Beg was a complex man, as all rulers are, and the more I read about him, the less I know what to think. He was the one who made the Golden Horde a truly Islamic state, but he was also the one who set the stage for its collapse. Because here is the irony. The conversion to Islam, which gave the Golden Horde a new identity and a new legitimacy in the eyes of the Muslim world, also deepened the divisions within the Mongol ruling class. The old shamanists resented the new faith. The Buddhist Mongol princes in the east looked at Beg with suspicion. The Russian principalities, which had always maintained their Orthodox Christian identity, now had an added religious reason to resist Mongol authority. And the trade routes, which had been the horde's lifeblood, were beginning to shift. The rise of the Ottoman Turks, the growth of European maritime trade, the fragmentation of the Mongol states in Persia and Central Asia. All of these trends were slowly redirecting the flow of commerce away from the Volga and toward the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Sarai was becoming a backwater, a city that had once been the center of the world and was now just another provincial capital in a shrinking empire. If you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine a city that has lost its reason for existing. The trade caravans still come, but they are fewer than before. The merchants still sell their goods, but the prices are lower. The Khan still sits on his throne, but the ambassadors who come to pay tribute are more grudging, more calculating, more likely to test the limits of Mongol patience. The old men who remember the days of Batu sit in the market squares and tell stories of the great conquests, and the young men listen with a mixture of pride and envy and doubt. They have heard these stories 100 times. They have never seen a battle themselves. They have never ridden a horse more than a day's journey from their own pasture. The blood of Genghis Khan runs in their veins, but the blood is thinner, and the world has moved on. It was in this atmosphere of decay that a new power was rising in the forests to the north. The Grand Principality of Moscow, once a minor trading post on the Moscow River, had grown rich and strong under the careful guidance of princes who understood that the Mongols could be managed. Prince Ivan I, known as Ivan Khalida, Ivan Moneybags, spent his reign in the early 14th century collecting tribute for the Mongols and keeping a share for himself. He visited Sarai so often that the Mongols began to trust him more than they trusted their own governors. He crushed rebellions against Mongol rule on their behalf. He secured the title of Grand Prince for himself and his descendants, and he did it all without ever raising a sword against the horde, because he understood something that the Mongol Khans themselves had forgotten. The empire does not fall to a single blow. It falls to 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 tributes that were a little too high, 1,000 promises that were a little too carefully worded, 1,000 moments when the vassals learned that the master was not paying attention. The Golden Horde would survive for another century after Beg, but it would survive as a shadow of itself, racked by civil wars, torn between rival khans, slowly losing control of the Russian principalities that had once trembled at its name. The Great Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where the Russian Prince Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army under Khan Mamai, was not the end of the horde. The Mongols would recover, sack Moscow in 1382, and continue to extract tribute for decades to come. But it was the moment when everyone knew that the balance had shifted. The descendants of Genghis Khan were no longer the masters of the world. They were a dying fire, still warm enough to burn the careless, but no longer capable of lighting the sky. And if you want to know how a fire dies, you have to look south, to the heart of the old conquests, to the Ilkhanate in Persia, where the Mongol experiment in civilization was about to become a cautionary tale. The fire that was the Golden Horde still smoldered in the north, but the conflagration that had once been the Ilkhanate in Persia was already ash by the time the 14th century reached its midpoint. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the beginning of the Ilkhanate, to the moment when Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, marched into Mesopotamia with an army that seemed to have been sent by a world without mercy. He had orders from his brother Merk, the great Khan, to subdue the Persian heretics, by which Merk meant the Ismaili assassins of Ilkhanate, and then to either negotiate with or destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The assassins fell first, their mountain fortress of Ilkhanate surrendering in 1256 after a siege that combined psychological terror with overwhelming force. Hulagu's soldiers dismantled the castle stone by stone, burned the library of esoteric knowledge that the assassins had accumulated over centuries, and executed the Grand Master Rukin al-Din Kersha and his entire family. It was a warning to the rest of the Islamic world: submit or be erased. The Caliph in Baghdad did not submit, and the results were catastrophic beyond any calculation that the city's inhabitants could have imagined. The Mongols surrounded the city in January 1258, and for the next 6 weeks they tightened the noose. The Caliph al-Mustasim, a man whose main qualifications for his office were a piety that seemed to have no military component, and a confidence that God would not abandon the seat of the Prophet's successors, watched as his army was destroyed, his walls breached, his city flooded with soldiers who had no interest in ransom or negotiation. When the Mongols finally entered Baghdad, they killed for 7 days. The figure of 1 million dead is probably an exaggeration. The city's population was likely between 200,000 and 300,000, but the chronicles agree that the slaughter was methodical, industrial, total. The Grand Vizier was executed first, then the Caliph himself, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, so that his royal blood would not touch the ground. The libraries of Baghdad, which held manuscripts from the entire history of Islamic civilization, were thrown into the Tigris. The water ran black with ink and red with blood, and the city that had been the intellectual center of the world for 5 centuries ceased to exist as anything but a memory. When I first read the account of Baghdad's fall, I was not shocked by the violence. I had read enough Mongol history by then to expect it, but by the sheer pointlessness of the destruction. Hulagu had no interest in ruling Iraq. He did not settle there. He did not rebuild the irrigation canals that the Mongols had deliberately destroyed. He did not even stay long enough to collect the tribute. He moved on further west, toward Syria and the Mamluk Sultanate, leaving behind a wasteland that would take generations to recover. The Ilkhanate that Hulagu founded had its capital not in Baghdad, but in Marikeh, a small city in northwestern Persia, and later in Tabriz, which was closer to the Mongol heartland and safer from rebellion. The Mongols of Persia did not want to become Persians. They wanted to rule Persians while remaining Mongols, which is a little like trying to ride a horse while also sleeping in a bed, and inevitably something gives. Hulagu died in 1265 at the age of about 48, and his son Abaka succeeded him. Abaka was a Buddhist, like his father, and his reign was marked by a continuous war with the Golden Horde to the north, and an uneasy truce with the Mamluks to the west. He tried to forge an alliance with the Christian powers of Europe, the Pope, the King of France, the English Crusaders, proposing a joint campaign against the Mamluks that would split the Islamic world between a Mongol advance from the east and a Christian crusade from the west. The letters that passed between the Ilkhanate and the courts of Europe are some of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval world. Abaka writes to Pope Clement IV in 1267, offering to restore Jerusalem to Christendom if the Pope will send troops to assist the Mongol army. The Pope, who had no troops to spare and no trust for a Mongol who called himself a Buddhist, replied with polite evasions. The alliance never materialized, and the Mamluks remained the one power that the Mongols could not defeat. But I think the failure of the Mongol-Christian alliance is more than just a military footnote. It reveals something deep about how the descendants of Genghis Khan understood their own power. They believed, genuinely, that they could make alliances with anyone because they had never encountered a civilization that did not eventually submit to their terms. The Christians of Europe were supposed to see the logic. The Mongols would destroy the Muslims, and in exchange, the Christians would help the Mongols rule the world. But the Christians did not see it that way. They saw the Mongols as barbarians, as the hordes of Gog and Magog prophesied in the book of Revelation, as a punishment sent by God rather than a partner. The Mongols could not understand why their offer was refused. They had conquered everything from Korea to Hungary. They had crushed every army that opposed them, and yet the tiny cities of Europe, divided among themselves, huddled behind their stone walls, refused to accept the inevitable. It was the first time that the Mongol worldview had met something it could not absorb, and the crack that opened in their understanding would only widen with time. The later Ilkhans built cities, patronized historians, experimented with administrative reforms, and gradually became something they had never intended to become. civilized. The great historian Rashid al-Din, who served as the vizier to the Ilkhan in the early 14th century, composed a universal history that is still one of the most important sources for Mongol history. He wrote about China and India and Europe and the Islamic world with a breadth of knowledge that no previous historian had matched. And he did it under the patronage of a Mongol prince who had converted to Islam and taken the Muslim name Ghazan. When I read the introduction to Rashid al-Din's work, where he describes the diversity of the Mongol Empire and the variety of its peoples, I sense a genuine intellectual curiosity that seems almost modern. The Mongols, for all their violence, were culturally curious in a way that their contemporaries were not. They wanted to know about the world they had conquered. They wanted to record it, understand it, and in some sense possess it through knowledge. Rashid al-Din's history is the monument to this curiosity, and it is also a monument to the fragility of everything the Mongols built. Ghazan himself, who reigned from 1295 to 1304, was perhaps the most interesting of all the Ilkhans. He had been raised a Buddhist, but when he saw that the majority of his subjects were Muslim, and that the constant war with the Mamluk Sultanate was bleeding his kingdom dry, he converted to Islam and made it the state religion. It was a calculated decision, and Ghazan was nothing if not calculating. He reformed the tax system, standardized weights and measures, built new irrigation canals, and tried to restore the agricultural economy that his grandfather Hulagu had destroyed. He also executed Rashid al-Din's rival, a fellow vizier who had been siphoning funds, and he crushed a rebellion of Mongol nobles who resented his reforms with the same ruthlessness that he had once shown on the battlefield. Ghazan was a man who tried to save the Ilkhanate by changing it from within, and I honestly cannot decide if he was a visionary or a fool. The changes he made were necessary. The Mongol military aristocracy had been bleeding the country dry, and without reform, the Ilkhanate would have collapsed even faster than it did. But the reforms also alienated the Mongol nobility, the very class that the Ilkhan depended on for military support. You cannot reform a system from within without breaking some of the parts that hold it together. And the Ilkhanate was held together by nothing but the loyalty of armed men. Ghazan died in 1304 at the age of 33, probably from a combination of the disease that had plagued him for years and the exhaustion of ruling an empire that was, by then, ungovernable. His brother Earl J2 succeeded him, and Earl J2 was a man who could not decide what he believed. For 10 years, he converted back and forth between Sunnism, Shi'ism, Buddhism, and Christianity, depending on which faction at court had his ear and which astrologer predicted the best outcome. He built a new capital at Sultaniya, a city of domes and minarets and gardens that was supposed to be the perfect city, a monument to Mongol civilization. But the perfect city could not save an imperfect empire. The treasury was empty. The army was divided. The Mongol nobles had retreated to their own domains and were ruling as independent princes, paying lip service to the Ilkhan while ignoring his commands. When Earl J2 died in 1316, his son Abu Sa'd was only 12 years old, and the regency that took control of the Ilkhanate was a collection of competing factions, each one more interested in its own survival than in the health of the state. Abu Sa'd's reign from 1316 to 1335 was the final act of the Ilkhanate. He was a competent ruler by most accounts, but he could not reverse the trends that had been accumulating for decades. The plague that would later devastate Europe, the Black Death, was already moving through Asia, and it struck the Ilkhanate with particular ferocity. Agricultural production collapsed. Trade routes were abandoned. Cities that had survived the Mongol conquest now died from disease or starvation or both. The Mongol army, already weakened by internal divisions, could not maintain order, and local governors began to act as independent rulers. When Abu Sa'd died in 1335 without a male heir, he had several daughters, but no surviving sons. The Ilkhanate simply dissolved. There was no dramatic invasion from outside, no single enemy that destroyed it. The state that Hulagu had founded with fire and blood fell apart through a combination of disease, economic collapse, and the quiet refusal of its own subjects to continue obeying. To me, the most unsettling part of the Ilkhanate's fall is how little anyone outside the Mongol world seems to have noticed. The Arab chroniclers recorded the fragmentation of the Ilkhanate into a dozen small successor states: the Jaliyurids in Iraq, the Chobanids in Azerbaijan, the Muzaffarids in Persia. But they did not treat it as a world historical event. It was just another empire that had risen and fallen, another dynasty that had failed to hold its conquests together. The Mongols had entered the Middle East like a flood, and like a flood they had receded, leaving behind a landscape that was permanently changed, but not permanently Mongol. The irrigation canals that Hulagu had destroyed were still broken. The libraries that had been thrown into the Tigris were still empty, and the descendants of Genghis Khan, who had once ruled from the Oxus to the Mediterranean, were now scattered across the region, some of them still claiming the title of prince, most of them simply trying to survive in a world that had moved on. If you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine the silence of a city that has lost its purpose. Tabriz, after the collapse of the Ilkhanate, was still a commercial center, but it was no longer a capital. The great palace that the Ilkhans had built fell into disrepair. The gardens grew wild. The merchants who had come from all over the world to trade at the Mongol court began to stay away, finding safer routes through Ottoman territory or the ports of the Mediterranean. The Mongol princes who remained in the region did not know what to do with themselves. They had been raised to rule, to conquer, to command, but there was no empire left to command, and the petty kingdoms they carved out for themselves were too small to satisfy the hunger that their bloodline demanded. Some of them converted fully to Islam and tried to become Persian or Turkish aristocrats. Others rebelled, fought, died in battles that no one remembers, forgotten by history, except for a brief mention in a local chronicle. The blood of the conqueror had not made them invincible. It had made them obsolete, clinging to a memory of greatness that the world had already forgotten. But the Mongols were not finished, not yet. While the Ilkhanate dissolved and the Golden Horde weakened, a third branch of the family was stirring in Central Asia, in the Khanate that had always been the most ill-defined and the most violent. The Chagatai Khanate, named for Genghis Khan's second son, had no fixed capital, no settled population, no great cities to administer. It was a steppe Khanate, a rider's domain, and its princes were the most traditional of all the Mongol rulers, and also the most unstable. They had watched their cousins in Persia and China grow soft, adopt foreign religions, build palaces, lose their edge. The Chagatai Mongols had done none of this. They remained on horseback, they drank mare's milk, they fought each other for pasture and power, and they waited for the moment when the world would need them again. And in the middle of the 14th century, a man was born among them who would set the steppe on fire one last time. A man whose name would echo through the mountains of Asia for centuries after he was dust. The horse tracks had been diverging for 100 years, and now they were about to converge again on a single rider who carried the blood of Genghis Khan and the hunger of the wolf. The rider who rose from the Chagatai steppe was not, strictly speaking, a descendant of Genghis Khan by direct male lineage. He was born in 1336 near the city of Sharai-Sabz, in what is now southern Uzbekistan, to a minor chieftain of the Barlas tribe, a clan that claimed descent from Genghis's own army, but not from his blood. His name was Timur, which means iron, and he would eventually be known to the West as Tamerlane, the lame, because an arrow wound in his youth had left his right leg shorter than his left, and his right hand partially paralyzed. He was no physical specimen of the conqueror, and yet he carried in his mind a vision of empire that would make him the last figure in history, capable of terrifying the world from the Danube to the Indus. When I first read about Timur's rise, I was struck by a peculiar detail. He never proclaimed himself Khan. He always installed a puppet, Jenghisid prince as the nominal ruler, a man with the sacred bloodline, while he himself ruled as a mere commander, the hand behind the throne. He understood something that the other descendants had forgotten. The blood of Genghis Khan was a currency that could be spent, and he had no desire to counterfeit it. He would rule. They would be the mask. The Chagatai Khanate that Timur inherited was not so much a state as a condition of permanent violence. The Ulus, the tribal confederation, had been tearing itself apart for decades, with rival Khans rising and falling like the seasons, each one killing his predecessor and being killed by his successor in turn. The old sources describe a world where the pasture boundaries were constantly shifting, where a man could wake up under the authority of one Khan and go to sleep under the authority of another, where loyalty was measured in months rather than years. It was into this chaos that Timur inserted himself, not as a conqueror, but as a negotiator, a strategist, a man who knew that the fastest way to power in a fragmented world was not to fight everyone, but to make everyone feel that you were fighting for them. He married a princess of the Genghisid line, a woman named Sare Mulk Khanum, whose father was the Chagatai Khanate. And through this marriage, he gained a legitimacy that his own birth could not provide. He was still not a Khan, but he was linked to the Khan's blood, and in the world of the steppe, that proximity was almost as good as possession. For the first 2 decades of his career, Timur fought not against the great empires of the world, but against his own cousins, his own allies, his own former patrons. He built a power base in Transoxiana, the region between the Amu Darya and Sirdarya rivers, and he slowly eliminated every rival who could threaten his position. He was a master of the long game, willing to lose a battle to win a campaign, willing to retreat 1,000 miles to regroup and return with a larger army. A 1365 document from Samarkand, preserved in the memoirs of a contemporary chronicler, records that Timur lost a major engagement against an alliance of Mongol tribes, losing almost his entire army, and was forced to flee into the desert with only 40 followers. Most men would have accepted this as a sign from fate. Timur treated it as a lesson. Within 3 years, he had rebuilt his forces, defeated his enemies, and taken control of the entire region. To me, this ability to absorb defeat and convert it into future victory is the most genuinely terrifying thing about him. He did not have the invincibility of Genghis Khan. He had something more dangerous: persistence without shame. Once Timur had consolidated his base in Central Asia, he turned his attention outward, and the pattern of his campaigns was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. He struck westward into Persia, the same lands that had been ruled by the Ilkhanate before its collapse, and he found a region divided among a dozen small dynasties, none of whom could coordinate against him. The city of Isfahan resisted in 1387, and Timur responded by constructing a pyramid of 70,000 human skulls on the plain outside the city walls. This was not random cruelty. It was a calculated message, delivered with the kind of architectural precision that only a man who thought of himself as a builder of cities could devise. The skull pyramid was Timur's signature, his calling card, and every city that saw its approach understood what surrender meant and what resistance cost. When I read the account of Isfahan, I had to put the book down, not because I was shocked. I had read similar accounts of Mongol violence by then, but because of the deliberateness. The killings were not carried out in the heat of battle or in the chaos of looting. They were organized, counted, arranged in geometric patterns, left to stand for months as a monument to the price of defiance. There is something in that premeditation that feels colder than any battlefield slaughter. Timur's campaigns over the next 2 decades covered an area larger than the Roman Empire at its height. He conquered Baghdad not once, but twice, in 1393 and again in 1401, because the city had rebelled in the interval, and he punished it on the second occasion with a thoroughness that would have made Hulagu nod in approval. He invaded the Golden Horde, defeating its Khan Toktamish in a series of battles that destroyed the Horde's power permanently and opened the Russian principalities to a brief hope of liberation. He invaded India in 1398, marching through the Khyber Pass with a force of 90,000 men, and he sacked Delhi with a violence that the subcontinent had not seen since the first Muslim invasions centuries before. The official chronicler of the campaign recorded that Timur's army captured so many prisoners in India that the market price of a slave fell to the equivalent of a single loaf of bread. And yet, even as Timur destroyed, he also built. He brought captured artisans from every conquered city to his capital at Samarkand, transforming a dusty provincial town into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The mosques and madrasas he commissioned still stand, blue-tiled and majestic, monuments to a ruler who believed that the highest form of power was to reshape the world in your own image. But there is a paradox at the heart of Timur's empire, and it is the same paradox that had destroyed every Mongol state before him. Timur conquered for himself, not for his family, not for the Mongol nation, not for Islam, though he used all of these as justifications. His empire was a personal creation, held together by his own ambition, his own strategic genius, his own terrifying presence. When he died, and he would die in 1405 while marching to invade China, the empire he had built would fragment within a generation. His descendants, the Timurids, would rule for a while in Persia and Central Asia. They would produce the great astronomer Ulugh Beg and the founder of the Mongol Empire, Babur, but they would never reunite the territories that Timur had conquered. The bloodline of Genghis Khan, which Timur had always treated with a combination of reverence and manipulation, would become a faded inheritance, a name that meant less with every passing generation. I have argued throughout this series that the Mongol Empire was doomed by its own success, by the impossibility of holding together a conquest that had grown too large for any single ruler to manage. But as I reach the end of this story, I find myself doubting that argument. Perhaps the real problem was not size, but character. The Mongols were conquerors, not rulers. They knew how to break a city, but not how to govern one. They could coordinate a campaign across 10,000 miles, but not a tax system across a single province. Every generation produced new figures of extraordinary ability: Sorgatani Biki, Kublai, Ghazan, Timur. But each of them inherited a structure that was fundamentally flawed, a machine designed only for expansion. When expansion stopped, the machine had no purpose and began to consume itself. The descendants of Genghis Khan did not fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they were trapped in a pattern that they could not break, a pattern of conquest and collapse that had become the very definition of what it meant to be a Mongol. If you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine the silence that settled over the steppe after Timur's death. The greatest conqueror since Genghis Khan was gone, and the world he had terrified was beginning to exhale. The Ming dynasty in China, which had replaced the Mongol Yuan in 1368, was strengthening its borders and pushing the remaining Mongol tribes north into the Gobi Desert. The Russian principalities were consolidating under Moscow, slowly transforming from Mongol vassals into an independent power that would eventually conquer the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan and take control of the Volga for itself. The Ottoman Turks, who had been crushed by Timur at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and whose Sultan Bayezid had been carried around in a cage by the conqueror, recovered and rebuilt, expanding into Europe and the Middle East in ways that the Mongols never could. The Mongol Empire, founded by Babur in 1526 in India, would carry the Timurid name into the early modern era, but it was an Indian empire, not a Mongol one. The horses were still there. The bows were still there. But the thing that had made the Mongols unstoppable, the unity of purpose, the absolute certainty that the world belonged to them, was gone, and it was never coming back. The last attempts to restore the Mongol Empire were pitiful in comparison to what had come before. A Khan named Dayan tried to unite the tribes in the late 15th century, and he almost succeeded, but the unity he achieved was local and fleeting. Altan Khan, in the 16th century, brought Tibetan Buddhism to Mongolia and built the first Buddhist monasteries on the steppe, but he could not reconquer China. The last direct descendant of Genghis Khan to rule Mongolia, Ligdan Khan, died in 1634, fighting the Manchu, who absorbed Mongolia into their own empire and effectively ended Mongol independence for 3 centuries. By the time the Manchu completed their conquest of China in 1644, the memory of the Mongol Empire was already becoming legend, a story that grandfathers told to grandchildren around fires that were burning low. And yet, we still tell the story. I have spent this entire series trying to understand what the descendants of Genghis Khan did with their inheritance, and I am not sure I have found an answer that satisfies me. They conquered the largest empire in history. They broke the old world and built a new one. They connected east and west in ways that had never been possible before, and they destroyed civilizations that had stood for a millennium. They were capable of both breathtaking cruelty and genuine cultural curiosity. They could kill a city and then patronize its poets. They were, in other words, human beings, with all the contradiction and tragedy that humanity implies. Perhaps the only honest conclusion I can offer is this: the blood of Genghis Khan did not make the world better or worse. It just made it different, and then it faded, like a wind that rises without warning, changes everything, and disappears into the silence it created. There's a spot on the steppe of central Mongolia, near the river Anan, where tradition says Genghis Khan was born. There is no monument there, no sign, just grass and wind and the sound of horses grazing in the distance. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it, the creak of leather, the murmur of 1,000 voices, the hoofbeats of an army that once walked across the world. But the sound fades, as all sounds do, and what remains is only the grass and the wind and the memory that something enormous happened here once. If you would like to travel again, we could visit another time, another story that is waiting to be told.